my fellow assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins Podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. So welcome back to another weekend, my fellow assassins, and I hope you are all doing very well this weekend. Hope you're getting some time to enjoy it. And so as for this episode, it's going to be very, very cybersecurity heavy, which I don't think we've had one of those kinds of episodes in quite a while. We've had some episodes where we've kind of touched on some cybersecurity topics and principles, but we haven't had one that is essentially entirely all cybersecurity related in quite a while. And I gotta say, I think this one's gonna be a spicy one, so I hope you got your milk and ice cream ready, because you might need it. Because on that topic, I'm not gonna lie to y'all, I'm kind of ticked off right now. And the reason for that is the absolute despicable and disgusting things that some colleges and universities and other organizations in general are forcing on their students and members / potential members to do. The blatant, just the blatant like disregard for privacy, security, ethics, and I guess you could potentially argue the law is quite abhorrently flagitious to me, which, by the way, that's the second time that I've gotten to use that word, flagitious, and I gotta say, it's so fun to say, and I think it just brings so much like power and oomph, and there's just something to that word that honestly I think it might kind of be like my new favorite word of all time, or at least like for now anyway, until maybe I find another one. But it's such a great word. Now, I hear what you're saying, like you're talking about school again, and whenever you talk about that, you're always hyperbolic, which fair point. But actually today I think there's actually some credibility here, and when I talk about the stuff that we're going to get into, I actually don't mean for it to be hyperbolic. Like this, I think this is actually a pretty serious conversation that we're going to have, and I quite honestly find it pretty despicable, some of this stuff that is not only allowed to happen, but that is being proliferated and accepted, which we'll get into. Now, one thing that I also want to point out is I know this is a pretty small podcast, especially for my analytics, I can tell that. But once we get into this episode and you kind of see, what's going on, I really hope, I don't think that we're going to be able to put an end to this because of, how big this is. But what I do hope is that you at least get a better understanding of what's going on, and hopefully that you'll share it with all your friends and family members, and we'll just try to get the word out, as much as possible. Now, the reason why all this obviously exists and is allowed to happen is because that beautiful thing that no one ever reads called the Terms of Service Agreement, which in the application that we're going to discuss today, you really have no choice but to accept it. So it's kind of a question of, did you really agree to it, or were you kind of forced to with a gun to your head, so to speak? But before we get into all that depressing stuff, let's start off with some positivity with what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. So I honestly didn't do a whole lot of nerdy stuff. There is one thing that I do want to talk about, but really some of the bigger things was I used my Windows deployment service to deploy a custom Windows image on my MacBook Pro in VirtualBox, which was, I guess, pretty cool. Used my home VPN to get around some of that sketchy hotel Wi-Fi, because you definitely don't want, to just be browsing hotel Wi-Fi without any kind of, well, I guess you could. It depends on what you're browsing. If you're going to HTTPS sites, it doesn't matter too much. But that nice extra layer of security is always nice. But the one thing I really wanted to touch on, which starts us off on the topic of cybersecurity related stuff, is I wrote a program which auto-generates credit card numbers. Now, no, this won't allow me to commit fraud, nor am I trying to commit fraud, nor do I have any intention on using these numbers to commit fraud, because I ain't about that. And even if I were to use these, they wouldn't work anyway, because while the credit card number is valid, that special security value, the CVV, or the card verification values on the you choose on the back of the card, that like 3-digit number or sometimes 4-digit number, that's not valid, which is kind of what I wanted to talk about here. Which the reason why I couldn't implement that part as part of the credit card generation was because, based on the research that I've done, the values that are used to calculate that security, that CVV value, is the primary account number, the 4-digit expiration date. So if you take like the year, the 2-digit year and the 2-digit month, essentially, and then the card service code and a pair of desk keys. Which obviously I don't have the keys, so can't do anything there. I also don't know the service code exactly. I'm not exactly 100% sure what that's referring to, but I'm sure I don't know what it is, nor could get access to it. Oh yeah, and the algorithm's proprietary too, so that's cool. But so I guess because the algorithm's proprietary, I guess that's like security through proprietarity. I don't know if that's a word. I don't think that's a word, but maybe I can make it a word. I don't know. But the whole idea of the reason why the algorithm is secure is because nobody knows how it works except the person using it, which I'm not going to lie, doesn't necessarily spark a lot of confidence in me, specifically because, at least as to my knowledge, as far as I'm aware, I believe every algorithm that's been certified by NIST, which is the National Institute for Standards and Technology, every algorithm that they deem to be secure and basically unable to be, once encrypted, you're not able to get the data out unless you have access to the keys, essentially. That's basically what it means. All the algorithms that they deem to be secure are open source. Meaning, anyone can go and look at how these algorithms work and literally do the math or write the code to implement them, and they're still secure. Which basically means you can, if your algorithm's good enough, you don't have to worry about people knowing how it's used. So, specifically, I want to point you to, back in July of this year, NIST released a list of 4 algorithms that they deemed to be quantum resistant, which basically means that these 4 algorithms would not be able to be cracked by a quantum computer, which, as I believe we mentioned in a while ago in an episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, RSA, which is like one of the biggest public, private key encryption schemes, that is not quantum resistant. And once quantum computers actually become a thing, quantum computers will easily be able to break that encryption. So quantum resistance basically means that a quantum computer can't break the encryption. So basically, like what RSA is now to normal computers is basically what these quantum resistant algorithms are to quantum computers. Basically, it's not feasible to be able to decrypt the encryption, essentially. Which, by the way, all 4 of these algorithms that NIST certified, all of them are open source. So you mean to tell me that algorithms strong enough to resist quantum computing can be open source without issue, yet the algorithm to determine a security code on a credit card isn't. Yeah, not exactly that confidence inspiring, in my opinion. So if the idea that your security hinges upon the fact that nobody knows how it works and it's a black box, that's not good, at least in my opinion anyway. And I do have, for what it's worth, I do have an anecdotal point here. And that is the first time that I ever tried to write my own encryption algorithm, this is exactly what I did. The reason why it was secure was because nobody but me knew how the encryption and therefore decryption was done, which obviously isn't that good, because once anyone figured out how the encryption and decryption was done, they could literally decrypt anything they wanted to and full compromise of the data, which is obviously not good. So basically how my implementation worked was, it was basically a glorified Caesar cipher. So if you think of what the normal Caesar cipher is, essentially, say for example, every time an A character is there, you change it to a D, and every time a D character is there, you change it to H, etc., etc. So basically what I did was, rather than shifting specific characters to specific other characters, you would shift certain indexes by a set value. So for example, rather than, shifting every time A is there to D, you shift every multiple of 5. So the 5th element, the 10th element, the 15th element, etc. You would shift that by, say, 6 characters forward. And then for every multiple of, 2, I guess, so like 2, 4, 6, etc., you would shift that by 10 or whatever. So obviously, if nobody knows the shift numbers, yeah, it's, fairly secure. But once you know what the shift numbers are, you're toast. Everything's able to be decrypted, no problem. So the idea of security through obscurity and not knowing how the encryption works isn't necessarily the most confidence-inspiring, because, obviously this is anecdotal, but if that's basically the whole, strength of your security, if someone can figure it out and crack it, everything's done. You don't have it's not good, which is why, and obviously they're, at least according to the sources that I've seen, they're using keys, like they're using cryptographic keys. So assuming their algorithm is not trash, it should be fine to be open source, in my opinion. But I guess you could say there is that, extra layer of security and through obscurity, knowing that not only do you not have the secret keys, but also you don't know the algorithm to be able to decrypt it anyway. So there's kind of like 2 layers of defense there. So I guess, but at the same time, it is what it is. So basically what I ended up doing was, I made a really, I don't know if hacky's the right word, but I basically created random keys, just, went to a online random hex, generator, and then generated some random hex values for the keys, and then generated random 3-bit security or service codes or whatever it was, and then basically just XORed everything together and took the modulo of that and got the last 3 or 4 digits, and boom, there you go. Which, if that's actually how the algorithm's done, I can see why they don't have that open source, because that would be very easy to crack. But anyway, let's actually kind of get into more of the topic of this episode. But first, I want to start off with a little bit of a story time. So this week, actually, I got to play around with some malware, specifically spyware, and also in my home lab. And I also took a final exam. Now, I hear what you're thinking, okay, but literally what does either of those things have to do with one another? What does playing with malware have to, in your home lab, have to do with taking a final exam? Now, fair point, but as part of my final, I was actually required to install spyware, which, hence the home lab aspect of it, because obviously I'm not installing spyware on my main machine. I'm putting spyware where it deserves to go, which is in a VM. So in case you're aware, don't install any kind of malware or spyware on your main machine. If you're going to install it, make sure that is locked down tight in a VM and can't get out, or in some other sandbox environment where it can't completely wreck everything in either on your machine or potentially in your home network. It's not good. I remember I had a professor in college, an undergrad, that he showed us a demo of releasing, I'm pretty sure it was some kind of ransomware in a virtual machine. And the amount of precautions that he took was kind of insane. He basically brought in a router which wasn't connected to the internet whatsoever, connected his laptop to that, and then I forget all the settings he changed, but basically created a VM and locked it down so it really couldn't access anything. So basically having multiple layers to make sure that this malware doesn't get out, just to show it being demoed. So obviously if you're ever planning on playing with any kind of spyware or malware, make sure you're taking the proper security measures, and not just double check, but triple check and quadruple check to make sure that there is no way for that malware to get out. But anyway, back to the topic. I do have to say that I wish that the exam was, me letting loose this malware and seeing how it works, seeing what data it's trying to gather on me, seeing, what remote hosts it's trying to send the data to, and all that good stuff. But that's not what happened. And in all honesty, no professor, at least in my experience anyway, is dumb enough to send their students live malware as part of an assignment or final exam, because I can almost guarantee you that someone would inevitably release that on their main machine and completely destroy their computer and potentially their network, and it wouldn't be a good time. So if your professor would ever give you malware to play with, it would always be in some kind of sandboxed virtual environment, most likely in the cloud. That's a pre-done VM by some provider that you could, play around with it. But with that said, if you've actually had a professor that sent you live malware as part of an assignment, please reach out to me, because I really want to hear that story. contact@darkassassinsinc.com. So I mentioned it was, downloading spyware, but no, this spyware was actually used to spy on me while I took the test. And you're probably thinking, wait, why did you have to install spyware to take a test? Great question. There is this thing out there called proctoring software, and I use that. I guess technically it is actually software, but I put that in heavy air quotes, because if you don't believe me that it's spyware, let me give you the quote for what spyware is. Spyware is, quote, software with malicious behavior that aims to gather information about a person or organization and send it to another entity in a way that harms the user, for example, by violating their privacy or endangering their device's security. This behavior may be present in malware as well as in legitimate software. That is the definition of malware. Now, let me read you, proctor you, what they have to say, which proctor you, by the way, was what I used for this exam. Let me read you what proctor you has to say about their software. Putting that again in quotes. When testing with ProctorU, you will be recorded using both screen capture and your webcam during the whole time of connection with the service. It will be the student's responsibility to end the recording by closing the browser tab and clicking the red X of the chat box. If the student does not close out the recording, they will continue to be monitored by the screen and webcam recordings. What does this mean in English? Well, basically what it means is once you give them permission to spy on you, which, by the way, you're required to, otherwise you can't use the service, otherwise you can't take the exam, which means you fail, and tough luck. So basically, you're required to use their service, which means you're required to accept their terms and conditions, which means you're agreeing to let them spy on you, basically forcibly agreed to let them spy on you, and they will continue to spy on you indefinitely unless you yourself force it to stop once the exam is over. Now, in my humble opinion, I think that all recording and monitoring should immediately stop once you let the proctor know that you're done with your exam. Now, why this isn't done, I don't know, but there should be no input on behalf of the user to stop, this spying on you. Because if for some reason you forget or you're not tech savvy enough to figure out how to do it, they're just going to indefinitely keep spying on you, which is not okay. That's literally spyware, and I don't care what your opinion is on the usefulness of this software for quote unquote preventing cheating, but the idea that they can basically spy on you indefinitely unless you stop it is, in my opinion, kind of despicable and quite honestly disgusting. But let's go back to the spyware definition. So spyware, as mentioned from the definition, can be legitimate software, and ProctorU is considered legitimate software. It also gathers information about users and sends it off, while doing so violating the user's privacy. Specifically, once the exam is over, and if you forget to close out that, browser window and chat box or whatever, and they just continue to monitor you, that's kind of violating your privacy, even though, I guess arguably you could say you agreed to the terms and service, which we're gonna get into that. But yeah, so it's spying, like plain and simple, and that's what spyware is, spying. So yeah. Now, as we mentioned, the terms and service. So you might be saying that, yeah, you agreed to the terms of service, which means you're agreeing to let them monitor you. And, well, yeah, but I basically about as much agreed to their terms of service as a hostage held captive by a terrorist group admitting on video with the gun pointed to their head that they committed heinous crimes against the terrorist organization, which everybody knows that that's complete and total bunk. So, yes, I agreed to the terms and service. Yes, anyone using ProctorU agreed to the terms and service. But did they really have a choice to agree to the terms and service, letting them spy on them? Did they really have a choice? Because the option was either A, you let them spy on you, or B, you don't take the exam and therefore fail the exam and probably fail the class, or at least do poorly enough in the class that, or at least on that exam, that you might have to retake the class or something, and basically costing you thousands of dollars at best. So, yeah, excuse me for saying that I had no choice and was forced into this. Just like, yeah, the hostage didn't have to admit that they committed heinous crimes, but if they wanted to live and not get their head blown off, then they kind of had to admit it. So, did they really have a choice? I mean, I'll let you decide on that one. But yeah, and the reason that they get away with this is through the legalese of the terms and service. So if you try to go after them and say, hey, they were spying on me, they'll be like, whoa, you agreed to the terms and service that said that, you gave us permission to do this, which, I mean, as we said, come on, that's garbage. But anyway, basically the point of proctoring software is basically to stand in for the fact of you going to a testing site and having someone watch you to take the test to make sure you're not cheating. So basically the point of proctoring software is to make sure you're not cheating. Now, theoretically, this should never be needed anyway, because there's this thing called the honor pledge, which every student must live by or else risk being kicked out of the school. And basically, if you've ever gone to any kind of college or university, basically if you ever found in violation of the honor pledge, or sometimes it's called the honor code, basically the school has the right to kick you out of the school. So there's that aspect of it. And obviously the point of the honor pledge here is to prevent cheating. And obviously, if you get caught, best case scenario is you just get a 0. And then obviously worst case scenario is you get kicked out of the school. So now why this isn't enough, either A, professors who force proctored exams on students like through this proctoring software, either A, don't trust their students, or B, the honor pledge is a complete joke. Now, I'm not going to say what I believe personally about, those choices, but having dealt with college kids and dealing with some professors, what I will say is I believe there's a little bit of truth to both of them. Now, of course, there's always the third option, which I would assume there's a good amount of you that were probably thinking this, which is it's just to keep honest people honest. Now, there's some flaws with that argument of just trying to keep honest people honest. And I think the best way that we can view that is by, let's just completely remove the school argument from the equation here, right? So let me ask you this. Would you be okay with your company or organization or, whoever you work for, spying on you through your webcam, microphones, screen recording, all that stuff, all the time you're working on your computer to make sure that you're always on task and never goofing off or, potentially going, doing things you're not supposed to on your computer or whatever? Now, for what it's worth, that same spyware monitoring you at work is just keeping honest people honest, quote unquote, to make sure that you're not wasting company time. Now, I would reckon that the majority of people would not be okay with their company spying on them the entire time that they're using their work laptop. I'm just going out on a hunch here. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's some people out there that are totally okay with that. But I would assume that a lot of people aren't. But this is just another case of just trying to keep honest people honest here. But as another thing that I want to kind of go back to is one thing we mentioned in one of the earliest episodes of the Dark Assassins podcast, was this idea of privacy versus security. And this is like a prime example of that in action, because if you want the security, you can have the security, obviously, of knowing that your students aren't going to cheat or your employees aren't going to goof off. So yeah, you can spy on them to achieve that goal. But at the same time, because you're, getting that higher level of security, knowing that, they're not going to cheat, they're not going to do things they're not supposed to, you basically strip away all their privacy in the process. And also, arguably, you essentially lose any trust that they had in you is basically gone. Because if you don't trust them to be able to in the case of students, not cheat on the test, or in the case of the employees, do the work that they're supposed to be doing, if you don't have the faith and trust in them to, do what they're supposed to, they're not going to trust you. Now, obviously, if they have a history of, not doing what they're supposed to do, or they have a history of cheating on their assignments, then yeah, by all means, spy on them, because you have, cause to do so. You have reason to believe that they might, not do what they're supposed to or cheat in the future. But, there's this thing out there called innocent until proven guilty. So if you have no reason to suspect that someone's either gonna not do the work that they're assigned and, waste work time doing things they shouldn't be doing, or in the case of a student, if you have reason to believe that they're gonna cheat, if you don't have that, you have no reason to, spy on them, because you have no reason to believe that they would cheat in the first place. Now, obviously, in the case of students, let's be honest, a lot of them try to cheat, so I'm not going to deny that. But at the same time, if you don't have faith in them, they're not going to trust you. So going back to the idea of malware, let's just be honest here, and let's just call a spade a spade. This sort of proctoring software, in quotes, is malware, specifically spyware. And it doesn't matter if it's trying to keep honest people honest. Malware is malware. Spyware is spyware. It doesn't matter what the intended use is. Software intended to lock down your machine and spy on you through your webcam, microphone, and monitor everything you do on your screen, as well as take complete control over your system, taking control of your keyboard, taking control of your mouse, is spyware and is malware. I don't care what the intended use is. It is what it is. Let's take another example outside the software aspect, right? If you're flying down the highway at 120 miles an hour, it doesn't matter what your reason for doing it is. You're still speeding and it's still illegal, right? It doesn't matter if you're trying to get to the hospital because there's an emergency, you're still speeding and it's still illegal. Now, sure, if you get pulled over and you have, maybe the cop will feel sentimental to you and maybe will let you go. But at the end of the day, you're still speeding and it's still illegal. It doesn't matter what your reason is, right? Same thing here. If you have software intended to take control of the system, lock it down, spy on you, send your data to a remote server, it's spyware. It doesn't matter if the intended purpose is to make sure a student doesn't cheat. It's spyware. It is what it is. Let's call it what it is. So I don't know if any of you have seen those videos of scammers where they intentionally allow these hackers or whatever into their virtual machines and let them just do whatever they want. But that's basically, you take that video and that's literally what this ProctorU thing is. When I was taking the exam, they were like, do I have your permission to take control of your mouse and keyboard? And obviously I'm like, no, but obviously I have to say yes because I'm forced to. And so just seeing them control my system was so weird. And but man, and the thing is the other thing that they do is they disable a bunch of your settings and turn things off. And by the way, in addition to the recording and all that stuff of you once the exam is over not being stopped, they also don't have the common decency to revert your settings back to what it was. So imagine a hacker remotes into your system, takes complete control over your system through some kind of malware and disables a bunch of settings before you're able to get rid of them. And your system is still compromised because of that. That's literally what's going on here. Just maybe instead of your firewall being down, you lose the ability to take screenshots or whatever. But still, the point is still there. They got in, they disabled stuff, and then they left and still left everything disabled. They didn't even have the common decency to revert it back to what it is. Which, by the way, at the end of this episode, we'll get into how to subvert all this BS nonsense that they're doing. But stay tuned for that. But the other thing is, because they remote into your system and they have permissions as you as the user, theoretically, if you're logged in as an admin user, they essentially have admin privileges and can do literally whatever they want on your system. Now, obviously, in theory anyway, they shouldn't. But at the end of the day, they could. And it's malware. It's spyware. They literally could do whatever they want to your system. But the thing that I find quite funny is it's totally acceptable for a university, or by proxy like ProctorU in this example, to send you a link for you to download a piece of software and install it and take complete control of your system and spy on you, and that's totally okay. And not only okay, but like approved and, kind of pushed for in this environment of remote learning. Yet, if I do the exact same thing and send you a phishing email for you to download a link with the same software to spy on you and control your computer, that's fishy. I'm sorry, that was a horrible pun. The whole like phishing and it being fishy. Yeah, I know, terrible pun. But I'm just trying to lighten the mood a little here. I mean, we're talking about malware, a bunch of depressing stuff. Just trying to lighten the mood a little bit. But now that your eyes have completely rolled so far that they've rolled out of your sockets, if I do the exact same thing that they do, I get labeled as a cyber criminal and I go to jail. But when they do it, it's completely okay. Probably because I don't have the legalese behind me of forcing you to agree to a terms of service more or less against your will. I mean, I guess it's not completely against your will. Just if you want any sense of being able to succeed and not waste millions of dollars, or not millions, but not waste thousands of dollars, and not fail out of school. You're kind of forced into it unless you want to do those things. But yeah, totally your choice, by the way. You're totally let willingly under 100% free will. You're completely letting us do that because you read the terms of service and you 100% agree, no ifs, ands, or buts. Right. And like I mentioned, moreover, they don't even have the decency once they're done taking over your system to revert it back to the way it was. Now, the reason why I have issue with this is not only do they not revert your system back to the way it was, because obviously when they remote into your system, they go through the settings to turn certain things off. They could easily, once you're done, go back in and turn those things back on, but they don't. The other thing is, again, you're required, it's on you to be the one to stop this spyware from running once you're done with the exam. Not on them, it's on you, which in my opinion, that's terrible and despicable, but it's on you. The problem I have, I mean, obviously for me, it's not that big of a deal because I know how to, revert all the garbage that they did. But for someone that's not tech savvy, that might not necessarily know, how to turn this off or how to uninstall this software, that spyware is still running, consistently spying on them. And I've actually looked up, stories of people that they kind of forgot to change back the settings that they disabled when they remoted into their system, and they forget what those settings were, and now their system is, less usable because of it, because, they're not as tech savvy and don't know how to go back in and re-enable those settings, which that's kind of despicable in and of itself, that they basically they reduce the functionality of this person's computer because they weren't tech savvy enough to know how to undo the changes that they did to their computer, which that's literally the definition of malware. Malware is meant to, compromise your system And that's basically what they did here, because the person doesn't know how to go and undo the changes that were done to their system. I mean, come on. So, and regardless of what you think about the whole proctoring software thing versus cheating on tests, you can't deny that there are some ethical questions that come up here. And I want to I don't necessarily want to say which one is more unethical, but I just want to raise the question of which do you think is more unethical? Cheating on a test and violating the honor code, or forcing students to download spyware to lock down their systems, invade their privacy, monitor everything on their screen, webcam, and microphone, which feeds directly to their own servers to make sure that they don't cheat. Which one's more unethical to you? Now, regardless of what you think is more unethical, I think it's safe to say that both options definitely raise some eyebrows in the ethics department. I obviously didn't major in ethics, so we're not going to get into a huge ethics discussion here, but it's, just something to think about. But what I will say is, at the end of the day, the only person really being harmed, at least in the case of a student cheating on a test, is really the only person being harmed is the student not actually knowing the material and cheating on the test. But also, let's be honest with ourselves here. How many students that didn't cheat on the test and actually took it legitly and maybe even did well will have forgotten literally everything within hours, if not minutes, after they submit the test? So really, if you didn't know anything going in and you cheat, by the end of it, you probably still don't know anything. Maybe actually you do, because you had to go doing your own research and figure things out in order to cheat. But regardless, you didn't know anything going in. You probably don't know anything coming out. But how different is that from someone that memorized everything up to the point of the test, brain vomited everything onto the test, and then immediately forgot about everything 15 minutes later? At the end of the day, neither person remembers what they did, except one person cheated and the other didn't. So, at the end of the day, the outcome, at least in this, completely made up example, is the same. The person, after the exam's over, doesn't know or remember anything that was on the test. Now, obviously, the whole act of not being honest about it being your knowledge, sure, ethical questions there. But this kind of brings me into what I believe is the better solution. So how about, rather than, forcing students to install spyware on their computer to ensure that they don't cheat, what if you actually did your job, professors, and, actually made your own tests rather than, arguably violating the honor code and taking someone else's tests and using them as your own and calling it a day? Now, how do I know this? Because I've done it before, and I'm sure many students have done it before. My favorite example of this was back in high school. One thing that one of my high school teachers did, it was in my pre-calculus class, and basically what I was able to do is I searched a question on the quiz or whatever. I don't think it was a quiz. I think it was a homework, and I literally found the answer sheet to the exact homework that the teacher assigned. Golden. Now, another thing is, if you're taking a test and it's open note, open internet, open all that jazz, if you don't know a question, what's the first thing that you're going to do? Well, what you're going to do is you're going to copy the question verbatim and paste it in your search engine. And not every time, but a decent number of times, you're going to find the exact question and an answer to it Or you might even find the entire exam and all of its solutions. Now, granted, sometimes it's hidden behind some stupid paywall or something on like Course Hero or Chegg, but sometimes it's just completely open. So maybe if you didn't copy and paste these exams and actually made up your own questions, so even if you did search for the questions, you couldn't find the entire exam, maybe that would also reduce the number of students that are cheating on your exams. Just saying. But on the concept of exams, like, I get the point is to, like, test your knowledge and make sure you know stuff, but on this podcast, the Dark Assassins podcast, we talk about it from the computer science perspective. We're not talking about it from the history perspective, and we're not talking about it from the English perspective. We're talking about it from the computer science perspective. And the fact of the matter is, if you're a computer scientist, at least in my work and professional experience, I have literally never been told by my employer, hey, I need you to write program X that does Y and Z and it uses K algorithm, and then locks me in a room with no connection to the internet and tells me to do it, and if I don't do it, I'm fired. That literally never happens. Literally how it works is you get an assignment and you, to the best of your ability, you implement that assignment. And if you don't know how to, you use this thing called the internet or your peers to ask questions, figure out how it's done, do this thing called problem solving, which is, I would argue, like 90% of the computer science degree. Like, yeah, sure, you got to know how to code and all that stuff, but if you know how to problem solve, you're like 90% of the way there. Like, you can figure things out if you know how to problem solve, which, because problem solving is such a huge part of the computer science degree, if you're just forced to memorize stuff and regurgitate it as brain vomit on an exam, that's literally ignoring 90% of the degree, at least in my opinion, which is the problem solving aspect. So in the real world, because problem solving is such a large part of what you do as a computer scientist, in my opinion, the better version of exams would be essentially, here's a thing, figure it out. You can use whatever resources you need to, but figure it out. Which, credit to where credit is due, my other class that I am currently in, the cloud computing class, which I mentioned, I basically did no work at the midterm and still got 100 on it. That exam was completely essay-based and completely open everything, which, granted, I hated because I hate writing essays, but at the same time, because it was, one, actually unique questions, like the professor didn't just copy and paste from a pre-done exam somewhere on the internet, and they were like open-ended and meant to like test your understanding of the material. Like, you kind of had to problem solve. If you didn't, I mean, obviously I kind of knew what the answers were because, you know, I do all that stuff for a living. But if you didn't know it, you actually would have to put effort into doing the research and figuring it out and problem solving your way through it, which is a better test, in my opinion, that you can survive in the real world as a computer scientist rather than just regurgitating brain vomit all over a test. So now that we've gotten through all of this, what do you do if you're forced to install spyware on your computer in order to take an exam? Now, I need to put some caveats on this before we get into it. First of all, this is not a tutorial on how to do it. So if for whatever reason somehow you do try to do this and you mess up, that's on you, not on me. Second of all, by using this method, it does give you free rein to completely cheat your way through the exam, which I have to say, I do not condone cheating in any way, and the entire point of be even bringing this up on how to get around the spyware is literally just that, literally to get around the spyware so it's not installed on your host machine. Now, with that out of the way, how do you do it? So basically, what you have to do is you deal with this spyware, ProctorU in this case, how you deal with any spyware or malware. You put it in a VM where that flaming hot pile of garbage belongs. Now, one thing you have to keep in mind with these proctoring softwares is they require access to your webcam and your microphone. So you need to make sure that you can pass through your webcam and microphone and it's working. Just because your VM is supposedly passing it through doesn't mean it's actually passed through, so that's going to be something you're going to want to check. Because if they aren't able to access your webcam and microphone, they're going to say, nope, you can't take the exam. So you got to make sure you do that. Now, one thing you could also do is if you really want to go overboard and really, give it to them in the sense, what you can do is you can pre-record yourself taking a quote-unquote exam, and then what you can do is once the proctoring software starts, you can perform a man-in-the-middle attack and capture your webcam feed, and rather than sending your webcam feed to them, you send the pre-recorded webcam feed to them. So you could literally go off and do whatever the heck you wanted while they're still seeing the pre-recorded webcam feed and think you're actually sitting at your computer taking the exam. Now, theoretically, you could also do this with your microphone too if you really wanted to get fancy about it, which that would be the ultimate meme fest to these spyware companies like ProctorU, which would be absolutely incredible. And then, once your exam is done, you don't have to worry about reverting any settings because you can do two things. You can either trash the VM, or if you took a snapshot of the VM before you installed the spyware, you can just roll back the snapshot, and then you don't have to worry about any of their garbage BS and malware effects on your system. And it's completely gone. Everything is back to normal as the way it should be. So you don't need to worry about changing back all the settings that the cyber attacker, the proctor changed while you took your exam. So, yeah, that was pretty long and ranty, and I kind of noticed it in myself when I was talking that I think there was definitely some serious tone in my voice there throughout this. So I hope that you listener were able to tell that I was actually being serious about all this stuff and wasn't just, saying it for the sake of hyperbole like I've done in the past when kind of talking about these kinds of subjects. So with that, I think that's going to do it for this episode. We got another long one here, but I think this was definitely worthwhile to kind of get the information out there of what's actually going on here. And I hope that you would spread the word, share this episode with your friends and family members, specifically those that are in college, or those that are subjected to this spyware and, want some better privacy and security on their end. And yeah, just hopefully we can get the word out there. And while I don't think that we're going to be able to put an end to this because, these are, big universities and big and, ProctorU is kind of a big thing. So I don't think that this is necessarily going to go away, but, just kind of, I would hope that we can at least, raise some awareness and kind of get the word out about what's going on here. So if you enjoyed this episode, I'd ask that you leave it a rating and review and subscribe to the Dark Assassins podcast if you haven't done so already. Also, as I mentioned, be sure to share it with a friend or family member. And if you have any questions about this episode or you have any topics you want me to address in a future episode, feel free to shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. I love getting to hear from you guys. It's always a bright spot in my day when I get to hear a question or comment from one of you guys. There's a link down in the show notes below for you to click on there. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bool nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.